He said, "You're once shaved, always shaved." Okay, I don't make these up, okay? Some are better than others. My father was proficient at the Minnesota goodbye. The Sheffields call it the Sheffield goodbye. I suspect Palmers did the same. But anyway, what should be a brief process of ending a social call is extended by an hour. It starts with a glance at the time and well, I suppose I should be going, and escalates into offers of leftovers and new far-ranging topics of discussion. Conversation travels down countless detours. The visitors linger long near the door before edging cautiously through it, because it's not polite to just leave. The host walks them to their car and talks to them through the window for an eternity. And before departing, guests finally drive away. Rodney, sounds like Missouri, doesn't it? Thank you. Yeah, I'm not touching that. A lieutenant confronted, got one here for you, Stephen. A lieutenant confronted a recruit and said, "I hear you're complaining about a little sand in your soup." The recruit replied, "Yes, sir." So the lieutenant asked the soldier if he had joined the army to serve his country or to complain about the food. The recruit explained, "Sir, I joined the U.S. Army to serve my country, not to eat it." We got another one. In college, there's a bit of a folklore that says if a professor doesn't show up after 10 minutes, I'm going to tell you it's true. This is how we did it too, and I see heads shaking. Students should assume class is canceled. Father Rowan, however, was simply the kind of person who was never on time. When he arrived 15 minutes late and discovered all of his students had left, he wasn't the least bit pleased. The next session, he reprimanded them. "When my hat is on my desk, consider that to mean I'm officially here and present in the classroom." The week after, despite once again arriving 15 minutes after the hour, the father entered his classroom with confidence, only to find not a soul inside. Each and every desk, however, had a hat on it. I don't make these up. Now, I got one more and then we're going to get serious, okay? Now, this one I want you to know. You did not hear this here. You did not hear it from me, okay? So, just so you know that, you may tell it sometime if you can remember it all. As a guitarist, I play many gigs. Recently, I was asked by a funeral director to play at a graveside service for a homeless man. He had no family or friends, so the service was to be a pauper cemetery in the backcountry. As I was not familiar with the backwoods, I got lost. He was around Lemons, Missouri, somewhere right in there. I finally arrived an hour late and saw the funeral guy had evidently gone and the hearse was nowhere in sight. I felt badly and apologized to the men for being late. I went to the side of the grave and looked down, and the vault lid was already in place. I didn't know what else to do, so I started to play. The workers put down their lunches and began to gather around. I played out my heart and soul for this man with no family and friends. I played like I've never played before for this homeless man. And as I played Amazing Grace, the workers began to weep. They wept, I wept, we all wept together. When I finished, I packed up my guitar and started for my car. Though my head hung low, my heart was full. As I opened the door to my car, I heard one of the workers say, "I never seen nothing like that before. I've been putting in septic tanks for 20 years. No, wait. Apparently, I'm still lost. Okay, enough. Those that I pastored for, they let me do that. Never paid me for that section, though. We're going to have a little history lesson. For some of you that are younger, it's going to be new. For some of you that are older, maybe you've looked at it this way and maybe you didn't. Hopefully you did. I remember when I was in 1967, I don't know, probably 66, when I went into service, maybe I had $5. I don't know. I didn't have any money. The pay was really low, like $50, $60 a month. Okay? But it was a fair amount of money back then. I didn't have a car, and I was stuck out in the middle of the desert, 10 miles from Mountain Home and 50 miles from Boise. The only thing I really owned, besides what the Army gave me, or the Air Force, I had a portable radio, a transistor radio. And so one day I was just tired of being at the base, and I hitchhiked into Boise. And I remember I was sitting in Julia Davis Park. I don't know how I found that park, but I did. First time I'd been to Boise. I was sitting in Julia Davis Park, and I was probably smoking, because that's what I did. I smoked a lot. And I was listening to, I'm sure, some good Beatle and Rolling Stone music, or something similar to that. And all of a sudden, a young girl, quite attractive, which, I was young, caught my eye. She come up, and she began to talk to me about Jesus. Well, now that was a little different. And so I didn't realize that I had just, in that moment, in that space of time, this person I never knew had stepped into something bigger than all of us. It was bigger than all of us. But I didn't know. In the, I would say 62, 65 through 1975, a movement started. Didn't start in the church. Christians were involved, I'm sure. But it didn't start in the church. It was, as far as I know, it may have spread out of America, but not very far if it did. The churches didn't quite know what to do with it because it didn't fit the church pattern. And so that movement was in the streets. It was in the park. Some Christians called them freaks. They were called by others Jesus people. In Boise, there was a man who decided to take advantage of that and move them in off the park into a place called the Stone House. How many been to Stone House? There we go, we got some hands. Stone House had services all the time. Johnny Howe and some of us used to go over there quite often. And that was part of this movement. Later, I think they built a couple churches around here. The church was somewhat indifferent. Now, when I say church, I'm talking about in the United States, not Church of God Seventh-day, the church in general. The church was somewhat indifferent toward this movement. Some may have not even saw it as a movement yet. But, you know, it's the first movement of God in the United States of this size since Azusa Street. And that was back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, if I remember right. I didn't look it up. And people were getting caught up for Jesus. They didn't look traditional. They had long hair. They wore long clothes. They didn't fit in a traditional church. Some went, didn't fit. And the church didn't realize totally that they were being blessed by this. It was no accident that the early camp meetings, when I came into the church, had spread out of the tent, and there were seats all the way around it. Even though the church didn't realize that the Spirit of God was affecting the church as well as those working on the street. It was across America. Brother Mark used to say, during that time we moved into this church, he wept with me one time when he told me when it went away. But he used to get up to come up to preach and about where Carl sits. You've heard him tell the story? Anybody? About where Carl sits. He'd feel the Spirit of God come upon him as he would come up here to preach. And what he told me is he said, Larry, I began to take it for granted. Got a little lazy maybe during the week because, man, when he'd hit that spot, Spirit of God would just come upon him. Some of you don't know, but some of us were in this church at 5 o'clock in the morning praying every day of the week except weekends. 5 o'clock in the morning because we had to go to work later. So this Spirit began not only to move in the streets, not only to just to be amongst Jesus people, but even some of the music, Andre Crouch. Some of the music came into the church. Some of the choruses came into the church. Some of us was at Bill Siddon's house at midnight on Friday night, praying for each other. How many were there? Some of you were. This was a really powerful thing. Now, we didn't know. When you're in the middle of something, you don't know that this isn't the way it's supposed to be. You have to live long enough to look back at it. So the churches were blessed by it. They grew in number. And it was a wonderful time. It was a time that gave me initiative to work with Teen Challenge. David Wilkerson, the Cross and the Switchblade. You're familiar with that. It empowered me to talk to people in the middle of the night. I remember one night, because I was on a suicide watch line, and a guy was in a phone booth with a gun to his head. Woke me up out of a dead sleep, and I talked to him. It empowered us to do those sorts of things. We had a crucial moment in our church at Lodi, and I had to go confront for the whole valley there the two leaders for the Church of Scientology. It started at 7 o'clock at night, and a family was on the line, and the whole family was in the house. And we went till midnight, and my people were praying for me, and we were empowered. That's the kind of time it was. That subsided, mid-70s, was probably pretty much, a lot of these folks ended up in churches, and the crux of it was pretty much over by the early 80s. We haven't had one since in America. We haven't had one since. I always hoped I would live long enough to see another one. Then where are we? This story we're going to be sharing out of this morning for the next 20 minutes, I believe is a true story. Now, I didn't get it from the person. The person is a 27-year-old girl in England. But I'm assuming that this is a true story. I won't be reading the whole story to you, but we're going to read snippets with the scripture as we go along. Religion is on a steady decline in Britain. For a country that once ruled by Protestantism, today only 30% of Britons say they have the faith. 1 out of 3. Back in December, and this is evidently a group that did this called Refinery 29. I'm not familiar with them, maybe you are. Talked to 6 women of faith in Britain about how they prayed and how religion figured into their lives. But what happens if you lose your religion? Below we hear from a 27-year-old woman who was raised a devout evangelical Christian. I grew up surrounded by religion. It was part of every single childhood memory I have. I remember my earliest religious experience. I was praying at a summer Christian camp. Now, this was in England. They do just what we do. You know, at one time, England had some of the cathedrals are still there, and they were packed. And when different ministers would preach over there, it would overflow to the street. And it was just a marvelous movement of God that filled the whole world, really. And great preachers come out of that. You can go back and study it. But some of the churches today that exist were from preachers that were part of that movement. And that movement lasted a long time. So I understand today that some of those churches that would hold 1,000 and 1,500 people are fortunate if they can get 100 people in their regular service. Losing God. Do we lose God? But she enjoyed church. She enjoyed her relationship with God. And my parents were proud of my faith. At age 11, 12, and 13, I would walk around school telling people how I talked to Jesus every day. And this was not a religious school. Since my parents emphasized sending me to the best one, people thought it was a weird thing about me. They joked about it, but generally they were quite accepting. In Luke, the 19th chapter, in the 10th verse, the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which is lost. This young girl, had discovered that. Up until the age of 14, I prayed constantly. In evangelical Protestantism, It emphasized that you should have a personal relationship with Jesus, that you should pray in the same way you would text your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your mom. Now, England, and notice this probably isn't real old, too. I don't have a date on it, but it's probably not real old. The church I went to had a lot of confusing messages about sexuality. Boys never seemed to be held up to the same standards. They would say, don't hate the sinner, hate the sin. These are her words, I'm just reading it, okay, directly from her. At 15, I started drinking a bit. There were a lot more girls at my church and the Christian camps than boys. And so the boys at church would treat you like garbage, just reading, because they had way more options. Boys outside the church showed me a lot more attention. So I started hanging out with them instead. Still, when I got my first non-Christian boyfriend, I told him I did not believe no sex before marriage. Do we lose God in a moment or an instant? Did England move away from God in just a moment or an instant? My guess is it's over a period of many years. No one wakes up, I think, some morning and says, I don't believe anymore. I don't want to have anything to do with God. I don't think it happens that quickly. And I think this is going to be a pretty compelling evidence of it happens over a period of time for the most part. Luke 9:24 and 25. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. What does anyone gain by winning the whole world at the cost of destroying himself? Most people who lose God, most groupings of people who lose God, move more into the world. That's usually the way it happens. One step at a time, they move into the things that they didn't used to do or didn't used to think you should do. So it doesn't just happen, boom, but it happens over a period of time. First, I didn't go to church. I didn't believe in God, and now I wasn't a virgin, so what was I? I'd black out for a day and lock myself in my room and cry. I felt lost. When you have faith, it forms your entire worldview, especially when it's not chosen by you, but chosen for you. But suddenly, age 20, I had to re-envision society, myself, mortality. Granted, it wasn't one moment that yanked me out of my faith. It was an attrition over the course of 6 or 7 years. Losing my faith naturally put a strain on my relationship with my family. When I look back at my upbringing, I can't help but see it as somewhat cult-like. She's seeing backwards now a little bit. I mourn the loss of it like the death of someone, the death of myself, in many ways. In Luke, the 15th chapter, beginning with verse 1, Another time, the tax collectors and sinners were all crowding in to listen to him. And the Pharisees and scribes began murmuring their disapproval. "This fellow," they said, "welcomes sinners and eats with them." He answered them with this parable. "If one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them, does he not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is missing until he finds it? And when he does, he lifts it joyfully onto his shoulders and goes home to call his friends and neighbors together. 'Rejoice with me,' he cries. 'I have found my lost sheep.'" In the movement that I was referring to back when I was a young man, if someone that we were familiar with, inside or outside of the church, was slipping, we gathered around them and prayed for them. You may find this strange, but at Bill Siddon's house, people who were struggling, we'd put them in the middle of the circle and we'd all pray for them. And we were diligent when we were doing that. It's harder to lose God, I think, when the church is in revival and there's a sense of spirituality. But you take modern day England. Be real easy. And friends, this last 32 years have been hard on America since that last movement disappeared. Are there pockets where people love the Lord and are doing good and helping others? Yeah. What I'm not talking about is an individual church's situation. But if you've never been involved in something that's bigger than your church, bigger than you see people saved that you didn't even think would ever come to church. It sticks in your mind. You don't forget it. It's a compelling thing. Final message from her. And yet the strange thing is, I'd say I was probably happier before I lost my religion. Now that's how she views it. When you're Christian, as long as your personal relationship with God is good, as long as you apologize for anything you've done wrong, then you're headed to heaven. Everything else is temporary. But now if things are bad, they're just bad. If they're unfair, they're just unfair. You can't console yourself with the thought that everything is part of God's wider test or plan. You just think, this is probably it. I probably have X numbers of existence until I die, and then I'm just gone. I guess I've never understood anybody who totally rules God out. I understand an agnostic who might question, but there are people who just do totally rule an existence of a God totally out. This is where they're at. There's nothing for them. You just have to think this is probably it. I'll read that again. I probably have X numbers of existence until I die and then I'm gone. Wow. Sometimes I miss the idea of eternal bliss. I would say to this girl, it isn't over for her yet. She has some background, even if she didn't. But I'm wanting you to know that this story, which I believe to be true, is told in America hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times over and over and over. Church, you can pray, you can work hard, and you can help with some of it. But I want you to know this is bigger than us. This will take a movement of God. I pray for it. I pray for it for our young people, that they can live in a time when such a movement takes place again. God may use one of you to get it going. You know, that last movement didn't start in the church. It started by extra people. Do you know how it started with David Wilkerson and a cross and a switchblade? Fame. Him and his wife dedicated themselves to reach the lost in the streets of New York City. He was successful. Hopefully God will choose to move in our midst in America in a rich and wonderful way again. I am a result of that movement. Not many in my family have walked this path. And I would not have probably either. It makes such a difference. The scripture I would give this girl, 2 of them, and I'm going to give to you. Acts 17, 27 and 28. They were to seek God in the hope that groping after him they might find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and we move, in him we exist. As some of your own poets have said, we are also his offspring. Don't lose God. It kind of comes down to our choice to do that. Colossians in closing 1:23. You see, religion was never a game to me. Never. Never was. I never really fit in lots of ways. I still don't. It was a personal thing for me. I never got in church. One time I caught myself, I don't know when it was, but I found myself being a little churchy. In a sense that I was worried about what everybody thought and wanted to be this and wanted to be that and all those sorts of things. So I've been there. I've suffered a little bit from that. But it's not who I am. I cut my teeth in the streets of Seattle early in my Christianity, sharing God's faith and trying to raise up a mission church. I'm not as active now as I used to be, but it was a serious thing to me. I like to laugh, you know, I like good jokes. But when it comes to this, it's serious. Keep your eye out. If you think you see a movement of God somewhere and I'm missing it, you let me know. I want to know. I'm talking about a big one. I want to be part of it. I don't want to miss it. That's for sure. I think we could pray for it, don't you? I think we could pray for such a... Do you think America needs it? My. The pain in America we're suffering now from so many... I won't even go through it because I only have 60 seconds. But we are suffering. Well, this is what God tells us. Acts 17:20... Colossians 1:23. Sorry. Final word. Colossians 1:23. Yet you must persevere in faith, firm on your foundation, and never be dislodged from the hope offered in the gospel that you accepted. And Paul says, the gospel that I preached to you.